Okay, so let's start another session. The title, Testing and Automation and Cooperation, by Tim Flink.
Hello, I'm Tim. While probably not as scary as lions, tigers, or bears, and especially not as scary as all three of those together, trying to put together test automation projects can end up being quite a bit of fun. So what I'm planning to talk about is do a bit of an introduction, talk about where we are, where we're going, what this cooperation, collaboration, whatever you want to call it, is hoping, or we're hoping it's going to look like, have a conclusion, and leave some time at the end for questions. So just as a quick question, how many people in here have worked with general automation systems or test automation systems? So have you ever gone around looking for some test automation only to find something that you swear is almost perfect, and then you start using it and you realize that there's enough differences that you'd basically have to rewrite the whole thing, and you might as well, or well, that you basically might have to rewrite the whole thing? Does anyone else run into that? Have you ever been dumb enough to actually go through with it? Is that right? Talking about some of that, where at least some of us have seen this before, as far as how things can be really, testing tools can be really tightly coupled with the project that they're associated with. So we are, I swear I missed a slide. No, I didn't. All right. What I'm talking about to start with is something that we're trying to start between the OpenStack folks and the Fedora folks. Eventually, this may include Ansible and RHEL, but for now, we're trying to keep it. Well, at the very least, what I'm going to talk about is OpenStack and Fedora, because I know more about Fedora, and that's really what we're targeting for the collaboration. So, before we talk about the kinds of things that we want and the type of collaboration that can happen, one question is, where exactly are we? Within Fedora, we have a system in place that can run jobs in response to things like builds, updates, changed updates, composes, which is on the road to some form of CI. But the gating system that we have is, like I said, it's easily overridden and voluntary. Basically what happens is if an update fails too many tests, it's not pushed to stable automatically. But someone can still push it to stable if they should so choose. So it is a very, very mild form of gating. Looking at how OpenStack does things, they are far closer to more of, I guess what you could call a pure CI system than what we have in Fedora, if not exactly CI. They have their system managing the patches that come in. So there are reviews, and there's one system called Zool that manages the testing of those patches, the speculative merging of those patches, and the eventual gating. So that if a patch comes in, if it does not pass tests, it is not merged into the repositories until it starts passing tests. And while it's not quite a Linux distro, it's a complicated project. And from some of the things I've seen, when you can get past everything in one repository, when you start have to worry about the dependencies between Nova and Keystone and all those different things that OpenStack has, you start approaching some of the complexities that you find in a Linux distribution. So as far as where we want to go in Fedora is we'd like to get to more of that pure, I keep saying CI, and I can sit here and talk about this in abstract terms, but along the lines of you can't really talk about collaborating until you figure out where we are. More of where you're going is also needed. Looking to start with, there's the question of what are the inputs. When you look at a project like OpenStack or most single projects, it's relatively simple because you have pull requests, you have patches, you have some form of code coming in to usually a single point. Now, if we're talking about Fedora, what is the input for whatever CI or for whatever testing system that we have? Are we talking about changes that come into dist-git? Are we talking about the builds that come out of Koji? Are we talking about composes that happen within RHEL? And depending on how exactly we look at it, the system itself could change. And I think that what I'm going to be talking about today is mostly changes coming into dist-git, but it's my suspicion that eventually it's going to involve a little bit of all three for the automation that we're going to end up wanting. So in addition to the input, one of the other things that we need to have if we want to start talking about having a CI system is gating. I mean, you could have a system that sits there and tests all day, but until you actually do something with that and have it be able to stop things that shouldn't be getting in to disrupt your canonical upstream, you're not really doing CI. And again, looking at OpenStack, they gate everything, they start gating at least at the change level or the patch level, the things coming into the individual projects. And kind of going on similarly to the inputs, depending on what input we use, generally is going to decide where we're going to be gating. I mean, technically we could take the changes coming into dist-git as input and then wait until we get composes and wait until that compose passes a battery of tests before we allow the dist-git change in. That's possible, but it would be insane. And I'm not proposing that at all. I think it's more of you gate changes with your input of changes, gate builds with your input of builds. If we're going to gate images, like the process of, okay, the image has been composed, and it's candidate, it passes through a bunch of testing, and assuming it passes all that testing, it is then released to the mirrors. Something similar with builds. There have been plenty of conversations about trying to gate builds for Rawhide and the Rawhide branched and the various Fedora releases, where you can have the build, but until it passes a certain number of tests, it doesn't become either part of the build route. It doesn't become, go from testing to stable. Any of those combinations. And then getting back to the question of which are we going to use? For now, we're closest to the input of builds and gating builds. But what I'm wanting to move towards is to start doing it, again, at the change level. So that if there are proposed changes in dist-git to the spec file, to bits that are in the that are the sources of the package, before those actually land in the repositories, make sure that those are tested and they pass some form of sanity before they're allowed in. And there's a couple of things we need in order to actually start accomplishing this. One, which has been talked about a couple of different times, is what to do about dist-git. In Fedora, my understanding is that we're eventually going to have pull requests for all packages. So that the changes that we're getting are basically pull requests on a Git repository. But another place is somewhere to run all of these things. We can sit here and talk all day about, okay, well, go examine the Git repository, figure out how many things need to be run, schedule all of these tasks, but we need to have a place for things to run. And while I'm talking about the dist-git changes as our input today, if I start talking about images, we need to make sure that, for the sake of our sanity, all these different things we want to do can generally run on one system, so we don't have one entire team maintaining one thing, one entire team maintaining the system that Gates builds, and yet another team maintaining the thing that Gates images. So I think at some point it's going to need to be flexible. So the short way of looking things is the goal is to test all of the things all the time, but at least we want to be testing as much as we can before it's released. It's going to be a relatively long road before we can get to any of these ideals of wanting to CI the entire distribution, trying to make sure that everything is reactive, that everything is rebuilt when the upstream components change. That all the testing is done on every rebuild before it lands in anything that will get to users. But just because it's a hard thing doesn't mean we shouldn't go there. So getting to the part of this about the cooperation and the collaboration. So I can start in with these reasons to actually collaborate. And I know I've heard all of these before, and I'd be really surprised if everyone else hasn't heard these before. Where the common thing of, well, I don't want to reinvent the wheel. We don't want to reinvent the wheel, which is definitely a goal. Sometimes it still ends up happening, but that's certainly one of the reasons to start looking to collaborate and not necessarily go off on your own. One of the other arguments I have is that most people have far more work to do than they have time for. So if you start collaborating on you have two groups working on one thing, hopefully there is overlap of the boring stuff, so that instead of having one person on one team maintaining a runner and one person on the other team maintaining a runner, you can put them together, have half of two half-time people working on the runner, and then they have half their time to go work on things that are new, instead of just maintaining or working at a slower pace. In my mind, one of the other things is not quite as direct, but I look at it as a way to, increase awareness and improve your documentation. I mean, you can write awesome documentation. I'm not saying that you shouldn't do that. I certainly wish that documentation for a lot of my projects was better, but that tends to be just one part of it. When you have more people using the same thing, then they write about it more, and there are more examples, and there are more people seeing it, and there are more people writing about it. And I am of the belief that that will lead to more testing in the long run, just because you can have more talking about that same system. But as I mentioned before, who hasn't heard those reasons? I don't think this is news to anyone in here that, oh, wait, collaboration, wait, if we work together, something's easier? If that's news, okay. That's well, you've learned something today. But getting more into why is collaboration difficult? Like what I said before, everyone has more work than time. If you start adding goals to when you need to generify things, that can add work, and if you're already on tight deadlines and don't have much in the way of resources, it's one of those, well, do I tailor this exactly for what I'm doing, or do I spend a little bit more time, or maybe a lot more time, to make sure that other people can use it? So a lot of the times the answer ends up being the former, which I'm not going to belittle anyone for. I've certainly done it myself, and it's understandable. But it's one of the reasons why collaboration can fail. In my experience, test automation in particular is difficult to combine across projects. We've certainly had issues about collaboration and making sure we're using the same tools between Fedora and RHEL, and that's an upstream-downstream relationship. If you start looking at like Fedora and OpenStack, that's not an upstream-downstream relationship. Or other things that we've looked at, between like Fedora and SUSE or Fedora and Ubuntu, and sometimes it works out, but they tend to not be all that similar because the testing itself tends to be closely tied to a project. If you look at like between Fedora and OpenSUSE, we use Anaconda. I honestly don't know what they use, but it's not Anaconda. So, that testing isn't really portable. And that's just one specific example. Once you have these, unique inputs and these different test frameworks, things just that tend to grow organically tend to grow around the things that are there. And the question remains that even with all of this, can we do better? But we've talked about some of the general reasons that things don't work, some of the things that we're striving for. But looking at this in particular, looking at the difference between what OpenStack is doing and what Fedora is doing, our workflows are not identical. There is quite a bit of overlap. And it's not something that's insurmountable, but going into this saying it's like, well, our workflows aren't identical. This may or may not work. And the requirements are definitely different. You have a software project and you have a Linux distribution. They're different. So as soon as you start getting to these differences, in my mind, those are the places where you can run into obstacles that are difficult to get over if they don't become insurmountable. And I'm not worried about it in this particular place, but depending on which project you're working on and which people you're working with, there's always the politics. There are groups of people who have the not invented here syndrome. Of the variants of that, and I won't go into that because I'm also relatively certain that people know what I'm talking about. So, we talk about the risks, we talk about all the things that can go wrong, and all these hopes that we've all heard before and probably have seen not quite come true. So, are we doomed? No. No, in this particular case, and in a lot of cases, I don't think we're doomed. Because from a high level, and not so high that the comparison is pointless, the goals are similar. You can abstract it to the point of a complicated project with Git changes coming in, Git changes that need to be tested, Git changes that need to be tested for mergeability, merging those changes into Git, and gating the flow of a project from that point of view. Yes, there are differences, but if we can focus more on the similarities, the things that are different are things that can be modularized and abstracted. One of the other things is tool overlap. Both groups are heavily into Python, and Python is the primary tool for both OpenStack and for at least the development projects I've interacted with. And also what we're doing in Fedora is mostly Python. One of the other things that turned out to be an interesting coincidence is we're both looking to use Ansible for the heavy lifting. The new version of Zool, and to a certain extent, actually the current version of Zool, is very heavily dependent on Ansible. They have their Jenkins job builder jobs that are now being translated into directly into Ansible, playbooks. There are a lot of the bits that are in the new Zool v3 system coming up are based on Ansible. One of the things that we're looking to do in Fedora is something similar. Right now we have our Taskatron system, which works great, and I'm not looking to scrap the whole thing. But what we want to do is start writing things instead of our own Ansible-ish format to actually start taking playbooks as input to, instead of maintaining our own runner, start using the stuff that's in Ansible. Instead of writing our own module system, start using the Ansible module system, so that we get the modules that are out there for Ansible, which are far more than we're going to be able to write. We get the documentation for that module system. So it's not, hey, you should, it's like, oh, you want this new functionality? You should write a module for our system. We've kind of half got some docs over there, but ask us if you have any questions. Versus, looking at Ansible's documentation, and the stuff for writing modules is really well done because there's more people doing it. But with that intersection, I think that trying to work together becomes that much more likely because we're starting from similar points. We have similar enough workflows, and the things that we're trying to do have a lot of overlap. And it may not look like it, but when I first talked to some of the Zool developers about this, we were both really surprised from an architectural point of view how much similarity there was between the Taskatron system that's in Fedora and the Zool v3 system that they're writing in OpenStack. And we've both focused on different things. In particular, for Taskatron, we've focused very heavily on the local experience and making sure that if someone's writing a test and they can run that test locally on their machine with minimal effort, and by running it on your local machine, it is as identical as we can make it to the thing that's going to end up running in production. And they have some of that for Zool, and they're going to have more of it going forward, but they've spent a lot more energy on throughput because they have a lot more jobs going on, and making sure that the gating functionality continues to work, because if the gating stuff stops working, no one can merge patches, and that's probably going to be noticed. So by looking at this cooperation as the main point is the execution flow. And the actual doing of the gating, not necessarily, we're using this test runner, they're using, that test framework, that's a software project, that's a Linux distribution. Because we can, abstract away those things without too much trouble, we're not talking about sharing an entire test setup. We're not talking about taking, Taskatron and then replacing something in OpenStack land. We're not talking about taking Zool and replacing all of our testing framework with it. It's focusing on the commonalities in change flow, getting the gating to work, and the areas where we can help each other. So, assuming that all of this is still a good idea, and I think it is, whether I've sold everyone else on it is a different question. But what is needed? Kind of going forward is just an agreement that we're all going to benefit from it. As I was mentioning before, I'm not expecting, and I don't think anyone's expecting, things to be drop-in compatible. The times that I've gone in and kind of hoped that something that someone else made was going to drop into what I was doing hasn't generally worked out, and I think that's going to happen here. But if we came in and wanted to use Zool for more, or parts of Zool for what we're doing, going in, having agreement that's both or that it's beneficial to both of us, and we come in with work or developers to do it, I think that's a good start. Because, as I was saying before, I can sit here all I want and say, oh, I really want this thing to work, and I'm going to pretend that it's going to do everything I want in exactly the way I want, and I won't have to do any work. Good luck on that. And when you start getting into these things where you want to keep them generic, a lot of times things stay specific is because that's easier. So by going the more generic route, that can mean more work. So someone's going to have to do that work. And I also expect going forward, this is going to be a lot like, I generally describe Fedora as a duocracy, and I've heard other people describe it as well, where you can vote all you want, and it may or may not make a difference. If you come in with an implementation that nobody objects to strongly, no one's going to get in your way, and it's probably going to win. So I think that's kind of how this is going to end up working as well, where it's, we could object to anything or have strong suggestions on how something works, but unless we bring, the development hours and the coders to do it, probably nothing's going to happen. But I do think that's pretty much how it should be. One of the things that I've said a couple of different times is that we're going to need to have modules so that there's enough flexibility for both groups to, so that some of the same things can work for both groups. Some of this work has already started upstream in the Zuul v3, and that's really how I see this working out. At the moment, we're really not in the same place. In the last time that I was talking with the Zuul developers, we've gotten to this point where we're talking about, it's really kind of eerie how similar these things are. And yeah, it'd be kind of cool if, we could take this and you could take that. But, then going through things and, hitting the reality of, we're not in the same place today. This is not going to be, tomorrow we just switch over. But by, trying to at least get to the same point and looking at it as more of a gradual collaboration, a gradual transition, that's where I'm hoping this will end up working out, and where I think it will end up working out. So this is a bit short, but these are the first steps into a brave new world, at least as far as I think. Are we the first people to do collaboration? No. But it's for the background of where Fedora has been with automation. For various reasons, we haven't had many successful collaborations until recently. The first one I can think of that I consider really successful is the OpenQA stuff that has been running recently to replace some of the manual testing of Fedora composes. So, brave new world for us. So this isn't, I hope I didn't disappoint anyone, this isn't a, hey, we did all this collaboration, this is exactly how we did it, and you can follow these steps. It's more of a, this is what we're trying to do, this is what we want to do. If there are other folks who are interested, please help out. You can, like I said, stay tuned to see how things turn out, or, I'd push people to actually submit patches. Patches are definitely accepted. Help is definitely wanted. Any questions?
So you mentioned using the Ansible module system. Does this mean you might eventually get to a point of being able to use Ansible Galaxy as a source of tests?
The question was, if we're trying to use the Ansible module system, if we'll get to the point of being able to use Ansible Galaxy. And someone can correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding of Ansible Galaxy is that's for roles? Or can you do modules through, I think it's just for roles. I don't know if you can do modules through Ansible Galaxy or not. If you can do modules, I don't see a reason why that couldn't happen. I'd want to have a few restrictions on what runs on the test clients, but I don't see why it couldn't happen.
I was more thinking in terms of roles as test cases.
Oh, okay, so the question was more of, if we're going to be using roles as test cases. I don't see why not. Haven't gotten that far yet, but I mean, it's like, I honestly, that has been in the back of my mind, because it's like, you have all this user-submitted stuff. Why would we not want to use it? Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
That would be great.
So with the request for help and participation, is there a information source of outlay plans or potentially where to start discussions of participation? Basically just how to come contribute?
Okay. The question was basically how to come contribute if people are interested. I wish I had a better answer for you. There has been some movement in our organization recently, so that is a harder question to answer than I would like. But we have an email list, and that I should have put a link to, QA-develop-list.fedoraproject.org, or come find one of us in #Fedora QA on Freenode. Probably find me or M. Kryzik or K. Peral. Just start asking about automation in Fedora QA, and you'll eventually find one of us. So yeah, I wish I had a better answer for you.
Hopefully we'll have a better answer.
And hopefully we'll have, it's like I hate getting up here and say, real soon now, we're going to have this, because I've done that before and then it hasn't happened. But I have a hard time seeing this not happen, at least having better plans, I'd say within a week or two.
Cool.
Any other questions?
About the priority in your case, so the first thing, we are still on designing, or we could do more work in the Ansible modules, or okay, let's just working on Zoom now to make sure we better pace for all this happen.
I'm not sure I understood your question, so I'm going to try and rephrase it, and you can tell me whether I got it or not. So my understanding was that you're wondering, where we are in this process and where our highest priorities lie, as far as whether we're to the point that we've already switched to Zool in our development environments, or, whether we're still in the design process. Did I get your question correct?
Yeah.
We're probably closer to the design process than anything. I think that, again, with the things that are changing right now, I think we're closer than we were, in a way. And I think it's going to be a gradual process. I don't think this is going to be, sit down for a week, design everything, and make sure it's implemented. I think this is going to be a very iterative process that moves us towards that sort of collaboration. The thing we're waiting on a lot right now is there is a developer summit for the Zool folks in about 3 weeks. And my understanding is their goal is to have a working module system, for the most part, working by the end of that summit. So I'm not sure if this answers your question, because I am dancing around it a little bit. We're closer to the design phase, and I think it's going to be an iterative process. Is that enough of an answer, or am I dancing too much?
It's all right. So the most focus will be on 2, V3, and mostly will happen there, right? For 2.
The question, it was a clarification whether, I think you're asking whether we're going to be doing much with Zool 2 versus 3?
So the focus of all the, in the center, all the things happen around, right? It's on 2.
Yeah.
That's it.
Okay, he was asking if the focus or the center of this was on Zool, and it is. I have a hard time seeing that not becoming a part of what we're doing, whether in whole or in part. At least in Fedora. Any other questions?
So is the plan in Fedora to enforce strict gating with no manual overrides, or what is the plan? Because I'm asking because I know from several upstream projects that they often have issues then that the complete development gets blocked because they cannot push patches because the CI is broken by something, and nobody is allowed to override it, not even the project leader, and Yeah, so they spend a lot of time fixing the CI so that they can actually do the rest of the work and nothing can go in at that time.
So the question was whether we're planning to go with a system that is completely automated and without the ability to override manually. The concern being that if there's no way to override the system, that there can be a huge backlog of patches, work effectively stops. Am I representing your question correctly? I'm hoping that in the future we're going to have a system that's durable enough that doesn't happen. Personally, I've spent a long time working on test automation, and it fails. I mean, there's going to be failures, there's going to be things that go wrong. I don't know if there's going to be a great way of getting around it if the whole machine comes to a halt, assuming we're to the point of relying on it. But one part of this is to override test results if needed. So to give you a clearer answer, for the short term, no. There's not going to be just automation. There will be ways to override it. And I'm hoping that those of us working on the automation will be able to gain enough trust at a certain point that those breakages will be limited and people aren't worried so much about it. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. Any other questions? All right, then we all have another 20 minutes to go take a nap or something before the next session. Thank you very much.